Good morning.
Good morning.
Saving the World and Your Children is the title. The title, the way I read it, the emphasis seems to be on the last part, children. Saving the world and your children. The way I read the title, it's sort of taken for granted that we'll be in the business of saving the world. One way of reading the title of the chapel, and I realize this title is not canonical, but I am still exegeting the title anyway. Saving the world and your children. One way of reading the title is that saving your children is somehow opposed to saving the world, and the latter is our real job. We're really in the business of saving the world, and we also might need to think about saving our children if we get around to that. I fear that perhaps some ministers might actually hold to this position. They might even argue for it if you really pressed them on it. And brethren, these things ought not to be. Now, I am not particularly good at self-analyzing on this particular issue, and I am not a full-time preacher. So I don't know that I'm the perfect one to address the topic for you, but I'll offer some thoughts. First, the Bible. What are the passages that tell us about how to be parents to our children? Well, Deuteronomy 6 often comes up in such discussions. And part of the reason Deuteronomy 6 is so popular in these discussions, I will just point out, is because there's not a whole lot in the Bible that actually addresses particularities in this discussion. But this is the Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord passage. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. This is Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5. And then these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on your doorposts of your house. And then it goes on to talk about your son asking you the question, and you answering the question about what these laws are all about. So that's one passage in the Bible that talks about this aspect. Of course, this doesn't have necessarily, it could be argued, but it doesn't have a whole lot to do perhaps with saving the world, but it does have to do with how to be a parent to your kid. The other passage I would point to in the Old Testament is definitely the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 1 through 9 especially has a series of poems addressed from the father, whoever that is, to the son, whoever that is. But we can certainly read it in our own situations, as I am the father to my children, or you are the parent to your children. And Proverbs 1 through 9 is advice on how to get your children to pay attention to the wisdom that you're about to impart to them. So the book of Proverbs is a resource on that. What about the New Testament? There are some things in the New Testament, again, not just a whole lot of stuff. When I think about parents and children in the New Testament, I think about Matthew 19:29, which is not perhaps what most people would think of, but this is the one I think of. Everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or farms for my name's sake will receive many times as much and will inherit eternal life. Jesus has got something a scenario in his mind where you are going to leave your kids for the sake of the kingdom of God. So that's interesting. As I say, I don't think many people take that passage into account when they think about Christians and families. I think there are certain things we need to do with that passage. First of all, contextualize it in the historical ministry of Jesus, and think about he is talking to Peter, who has done exactly this, right? He's already left his wife and his kids, if he had kids at the time. He's left his wife to follow Jesus around. He has done that, right? And Peter says that. He says, I've already left everything. And Jesus says, well, if you've left your father and mother and wife and kids and houses and farms for my sake, you'll receive many times as much. So I don't believe that Jesus is calling on us to do exactly that. But he had an idea in mind that living at home with your family isn't always the most important thing. For some historical people in the historical ministry of Jesus, it was more important for them to spend 3 years walking around Palestine following their Lord. But there are other passages in the Gospels that sort of affirm more traditional family values as we would recognize them. I think in Mark chapter 7, talking about parents, the relationship of parents to children. And the other one in the New Testament I think about is Ephesians 6:4, where Paul says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Again, not real specific, but we don't need the Bible necessarily to be real specific on these things, but just to give us the general idea. What we're going for here is bringing our children up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And different societies perhaps will have different customs about how to go about doing that. And so I'll make some suggestions on how I think that could be intelligently implemented in our own society. I will say, again, not necessarily an expert on this issue, although I do have 3 kids and trying to follow these admonitions from the Bible. And you might think about some things I leave out, and I will think we'll have a little bit of time that you can briefly share your wisdom on these things. If we want to save the world and our children, and this giving the emphasis to the children part here, then I think the most important thing we can do is marry someone who loves the Lord. In my own experience, there's just no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't have kids if I hadn't gotten married. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that my wife has been the catalyst in improving us as parents, and she has typically thought more about these things and read more and encouraged me to do better myself. And that's not always easy to take, but I mean that from a prideful standpoint, but it's always a blessing. And so that has been very helpful. So marry somebody that loves the Lord, and that will help quite a bit with that, as with other things, of course. Secondly, I'd say take your parenting seriously. Take it seriously. It is something entrusted to us by God that we need to fulfill. It is a commission that we have. Realize you don't know everything. Realize that parenting is not a crapshoot. All right? I don't know, maybe it's hard to remember. I've been a parent now for 9.5 years. It's hard to remember 10 years ago whether I thought it was a crapshoot or not. I think I might have thought that. I think maybe some of you think maybe parenting is sort of a crapshoot where who knows, you try some things, kids turn out the way they're going to turn out. It doesn't, can't hardly ever tell. Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. We are so accustomed to saying, you can't apply that in every case. We are so accustomed to saying that we think, well, it probably only applies in about 3% of cases. If we want to give it a statistic, we are so accustomed to saying that proverb is just a proverb and you cannot apply it in every case that we're almost ready to say it's not really even a proverb. It's really just some random thought some guy had at one point. It really never applies. I worry that we are almost to the point of doing that. Well, it's a proverb because it's a proverb, because it is usually supposed to sort of work. You're usually supposed to sort of have some influence as a parent on the way your children turn out. Now, that doesn't mean, in my view, that the child will turn out to be an imitation of you, or do everything you think ought to be done. But if you do a fairly good job at being a parent, that ought to be an influence in the child's life. It's not just a crapshoot. We do have influence on a child's life, so let's take it seriously. Spend time with your kids. Take it seriously. Spend time with your kids. You know, as we're all saving the world, we need to spend time with our kids. Spending time takes time, you know, and a lot of things with parenting, as with everything else, just takes time. And so you have to carve out some time. I could absolutely spend, you know, let's say I sleep for about 6 hours, spend 18 hours a day reading and studying. I mean, absolutely I could do that. And I sometimes feel a little put upon to get away from that, of the business of what I really am doing, my job, right? And go do things with kids or wife or other things that I ought to do. It's hard for me to do that. Sometimes I feel put upon to do that, but there's no question that if I'm going to be a good father at all, that's what it takes. It takes time. You have to carve it out. You have to, you know, it takes time to spend time with your kids. Think critically about your parenting. This is all under the heading of take it seriously. Think critically about your parenting. Don't be the type of parent your parent was just because that's the only way you know how to do it. Think about it. You can probably point to some things you liked about the way you were parented, and you can probably point to some things you don't like about it. Well, think about that before you get in the situation and adopt those things you think were helpful and reject those things you think weren't. Read books about it. Ask for advice. Ignore the advice that doesn't fit your own situation after thinking about it first. As with all of life, think critically about everything. Right? So think critically about the advice people give you. I'll give you some example of advice we have ignored after thinking about it. We homeschool our kids. There are some people who think that's not a great idea because of the socialization aspect of it. That's the thing everybody points to is socialization. Socialization, how are they going to be socialized? Well, I mean, I think if you know my kids, they're more socially developed than I am. But that's something we had to think about. I struggled with that for a time. I did think about it. I didn't just say, that's ridiculous. I thought about it critically, decided, well, this is what's right for us, and went with that. So ignore the advice that doesn't fit your own situation, but ask for advice. Observe good parents and what they do. Observe good children and see what their parents do to make them good children. My own situation, I am blessed to have a preacher, Chris Kemp, and his wife Angela, who are just fantastic parents. If my kids could turn out like Ethan and Samuel Kemp, that would be a victory. They are great. So I am blessed to be in that situation. We observe what they do, and a lot of times I need to be doing that. If that gets this result, then I need to be doing that. So observe those things. Take your parenting seriously. The third thing I have to say is do no harm. This is my own sort of Hippocratic oath here in parenting. Do no harm. This is the idea that I don't want my kids at 30 years old being in a therapist talking about daddy. You know, that's a fear I have. And so I think, what am I doing that is going to put them in therapy when they're 30? And let me stop doing that. So again, thinking critically about our own parenting. Love your children. Make sure they know this. Do not allow them to connect your love for them to their performance. When you discipline them, tell them you love them. All right. Number 5, discipline your children. Expect good behavior. Model good behavior. Teach good behavior. Correct bad behavior. This is difficult. This takes time. Just like with everything, this takes time. We give our kids chores. It would be a lot easier. I think I've mentioned this in chapel before. It would be a lot easier for me to do the chore. Rather than going to the door and calling in Josiah to come in from outside to get his plate from the table and take it to the sink, it would be a whole lot easier. I'd just get the plate and put it in the sink. That would be easier. Rather than telling Josiah, here's how you pick up a block and put it into the box. Clean up your toys. Pick up the block, put it in. Now do the next block. Now do the next block. Now do the next block. Now get the cars. Now get the next car. Now go to your room. Now pick up this sock off the floor and this sock and this. It would be a lot easier if I could do that in 30 seconds. What it takes 30 minutes to teach him to do, I could do it in 30 seconds. But this morning, he was putting away his clothes without being asked. At 4 years old, that was a victory. Expect good behavior. Discipline your kids. It is worth it. It turns out well if you will do that, and it does take time, and it is annoying. But it takes time, and it's what we need to be doing. Treat your children like human beings. This was actually one it took me a while to figure out. Treat your children like human beings. They are not your pets or your playthings or the servants or anything like that. They are actual legitimate human beings that have hearts and minds and feelings. And what I mean by treat them like human beings is consider that they have feelings too. And don't be sarcastic with them. When you have to tell them for the 15th time about something, remember that they have feelings, they are human beings, and you ought to respect them. Respect your children. Don't take every disobedience as a personal insult to you. They just need to be corrected. Don't read into motives. I mean, that's what I would say. Don't read into motives. Just because they're disobeying you doesn't mean they hate you or whatever else. Just correct the behavior and move on. If it becomes apparent that there's a deeper issue here, then deal with the deeper issue. But don't assume there's a deeper issue. Just correct the behavior and move on. It's not all about you as the parent. You're training the child, right? Respect the child. Treat them as a human being. Reason with the child. Don't just take them to their bedroom and slap their bottom, but tell them why you're doing that. Reason with them. Teach them through doing that. Convince them that they need the pop on the bottom. That's what we call it, pop. With a spanking, whatever, slap on the bottom. Somehow we got into calling it pop, but so that's what it is at our house. Teach, get them to say, yes, I need that pop on the bottom because my behavior was no good. I need the spanking. Reason with them. Now, this takes time, right? To do this, to convince the child that they need the pop on the bottom, that's going to take some time because they're not going to be there at the moment. You're going to have to do some work here. This past Sunday, I missed the first 20 minutes of worship service at Florence Boulevard. We were out in the parking lot because an incident had occurred on the way to church services, and there was some deception involved. And so, I'll tell you who was not involved. Jody took Miriam inside to worship service, and I stayed out there and tried to get to the bottom of the issue. I didn't know what had gone on, but I wanted to figure it out because I didn't want to. I knew who was to blame, but I didn't want to just go ahead and do the pop and get in there because we're going to miss worship service, and that's what's really important. No, this is what's really important. I need to figure out this, show them the way, model reasoning and good behavior, and that I am being fair and just and kind with them, and make sure that they see that, but also make sure that they know that truthfulness and honesty is really important, and this is how important I think it is because we're going to spend 20 minutes out here in the car trying to figure this thing out, and eventually we're going to get there. That takes time to do that. It takes time. Just like everything else in parenting or anything else, it takes time. I could have cut that short. I decided this is worth it. We need to stay out here and get this settled. So, reason with them. Treat them like human beings with feelings and emotions. And then the last thing I would say, in terms of saving the world and your children, is involve your children in saving the world. All of my children have gone door knocking with us as we've had various campaigns, doing things. My daughter Miriam, as most of you know, went with me this past July to the Philippines. She spent a couple of weeks there with me as we were on a campaign there. And my wife takes all three of our kids every week. She fixes food for a widow woman, and every week they go and the kids go to this widow's house, and they spend an hour with her, talking, sometimes performing, reciting the poetry they're learning or playing on piano or whatever, and talking with this widow lady, older woman. And by doing that, I think we are showing them what saving the world looks like on a day-to-day basis. Saving the world involves global thinking, but it involves local action. It's an assignment that God has given the church, and they, my children, are part of that, and that means treating people well on a day-to-day basis, people that you come into contact with. We try to model that with them. We try to get them involved in doing that. Well, those are the thoughts I had. Perhaps I left something out. I didn't leave quite as much time as I thought, but does anybody have a quick word of wisdom for us before we close on what you have found helpful about parenting?
Ed,
Yes, right.
you knew I was going to do that. Yeah. I want to tell you what Brother Cole said about punishment.
Okay.
Brother Cole was a good father to his 4 children. And he told me one time when we were having problems with our oldest son that if he ever told his children not to do something and they did it, then they were punished. But if they did something they shouldn't do and he hadn't addressed that specifically, he would warn them and show them why they shouldn't do it, but say, the next time you do it, you get punished. Some parents are guilty of just when a child messes up and you haven't really instructed them on that, just to go ahead and punish anyway. Mm-hmm. But I always tried to follow that rule that Brother Cole gave us about, if you've addressed it and they know they shouldn't do it because you told them they shouldn't, then punishment of some sort is necessary. But give them a warning that first time if they goof up and you hadn't really addressed it.
Yeah, I think that's good advice and sort of fits in, I think, to mine. Treat them like a human being. Yeah. I wouldn't treat people I work with like that. If I hadn't told them something, I wouldn't expect them to know it. But so think about my children in that way as well. Yes.
2 things came to mind when I was listening to you talk. The first one was, when we first got married, we always said, "Oh, I'll never do X, Y, or Z." And we learned later on, never say never, because whatever you said you would never do, you ended up doing, and someone usually brought it up to you later on that you forgot that you'd said you'd never do that. The second thing was, when you started, I thought you were going to go down the road of what I've always been cautioned on is make sure you realize that as you're going out to save the world, don't forget you have kids. A lot of times when we get so busy, caught up in doing what we think is so cool, what we think is so amazing, that we get this incredible opportunity to speak and do and praise God in what we're doing, is that sometimes the people closest to us kind of almost get forgotten sometimes. And that I was glad you went where you did at the end, talking about taking your daughter and things like that, because I think sometimes that's that's the biggest concern, is that when we go out and save the world, don't forget that there's people at home that need saving too.
Yes, and I think that also goes along with the idea that it wasn't a particular point, but I stressed it over and over again, and that's the one I want to leave you with is it takes time. If you want to be a good parent, if you want to save your kids and the world, it takes time to do that. You have to spend time with them. It takes time to teach them. It takes time just every which way. And Aaron has the final comment.
I was just going to say, somebody told me one time, because we asked, how do you get your kids to behave so well in church? And their response was, well, when we take them away from the worship service, we make it less of an enjoyable place for them. So they enjoy sitting there.
Yes.
Useful piece of advice.
Yeah, okay. That's good. Discipline, right?
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.